Hi, welcome to Crashes and Taxes. I am your host for this podcast, Rebecca Walser, and for all of my loyal Crashes and Taxes fans, let me just apologize. As you guys are aware, I'm in the Global Executive MBA program for the London School of Economics, and I was in London for about 20 days straight. And so it's kind of messed up my entire practice schedule, and obviously I have to get back to business when I get back. And so I have been a little delayed on the podcast, but guess what? It's going to be fixed. We've got a production manager who's going to keep me on track and make sure I am doing these podcasts for you guys. So I'm really excited to talk to you today because there's been so much going on beginning of fall, which is the end of September. And now obviously here in October, we are in it. And we have a lot going on. Debt ceiling numbers, funding of Congress through the end of the year so that we don't have a debt ceiling problem necessarily. Obviously, infrastructure bills getting negotiated. And I really want to talk about the tweet that was sent out, in the last week, 10 days by this administration, Joe Biden, saying that, the $3.5 trillion infrastructure package is actually going to cost zero. And I want to explain that for a moment to where he could come up with that, because so many people are saying, what is he talking about? That's crazy. And there is an actual fact that's associated with it of where it comes from. And it's the fact that they're trying to do the infrastructure plan through something called budget reconciliation. And what people might not understand about budget reconciliation is that when you pass something like President Trump did with his Tax and Jobs Act in 2018, when you pass something through the reconciliation process, you have to give offsetting expense. In other words, if I'm going to pass something that costs $3.5 trillion, I have to either revenue raise and or cut. So we have to revenue raise and or cut the equivalent of existing $3.5 trillion. And so that's why the reconciliation process allows things to go through within a specified parameter. So what Joe was referring to when he tweeted that was basically we have to make it assessment that looks like it will cost us nothing, because we have to say that we're going to raise more revenue over here, and we have to say that we're going to cut expenses here, and so that the net reconciliation is zero. And that's what he was referring to. So he wasn't in that particular moment completely crazy saying that it costs nothing. He was saying that through the reconciliation process, the numbers show that it's going to cost nothing. But if you look at the Tax Foundation, if you look at other non-political think tanks, everyone is in agreement that it is going to cost anywhere from $1 to $3 trillion over 10 years. And there's just no doubt about that. It is not a net zero. To give you an example with President Trump and how he got the tax cuts through even without Democratic support, again, using the reconciliation plan, and how he got it through was by sunsetting the tax changes in the beginning of 2026. In other words, he said, these are the tax law changes we're going to have, but only through 2025. And then in 2026, everything will revert back. And that way he could get those changes passed within the time constraints of budget reconciliation. So this is now leading me into the topic for today, which is, are we becoming, or are we already a socialist country? And I'm not socialist in the capitalistic ways that I'm necessarily talking about, but I'm talking about the beginning of communism starts with socialism. So I'd say economically speaking and politically speaking, I'd say on a continuum of political schools of thought, capitalist would be associated more with libertarianism or freedom, more entrepreneurship, more ability to choose what you want and how you're going to do it. And you have a political environment that supports usually a democracy of some kind, a republic or a democracy of some kind. And you have the democracy of the people that supports the market of capitalism, because that allows people to have the most freedom to achieve the most economic disparity. People can reach super high levels of economic and wealth, and people can also, have very low levels if they have circumstances either within their control or outside their control that doesn't allow them to perform well. And so that I would say would be the far extreme of freedom, libertarianism, democracy, republic, supporting capitalism. That would be the economic and the political structure. You migrate towards communism, which is the exact opposite over on the far other side of the spectrum. And communism is a political structure that overtakes the economic structure. In other words, communism is in and of itself beyond just a political doctrine, an economic doctrine, because it believes in state ownership and no private property. By definition, it is the state ownership of all resources, and there is no private property. And when you have no private property, you have a government who is controlling the ability of people to achieve economic heights or economic lows, right? So it is up to the government who controls the state-owned resources, how those resources are produced, how those resources are allocated. And so you have a merging of sort of political thought into the realm of economic thought. And this has always been my concern, by the way, about China. Because one thing that I really note about intellectuals and academia is they really separate and bifurcate China's communistic government from their capitalistic market. China is not dumb. China has used capitalism, or I should say quasi-capitalism, because they have a lot of state ownership. There's a lot of inability. There are what we call WOFEs, or wholly owned foreign entities within China. For example, Starbucks. Starbucks bought out China and all Chinese investors from their Starbucks operations in 2017 for $1.3 billion. It was one of the largest acquisitions of themselves they had ever done in history. And so what you saw now is Starbucks is now a wholly owned foreign entity within that division of Starbucks is now a wholly owned foreign entity within China itself, which is really interesting because when you look at China and you look at the data on China and you look at the economy of China, you talk about state ownership and then what would they call, these closely tied groups to state ownership. So they're no longer state owned, but they're affiliated with state ownership. So it's almost like a good old boys network. You can kind of think of it as. I was state owned and then I left and went into private enterprise, but really the private enterprise is the guy that used to run the state-owned. And so it's all connected. So they're state-owned. So when we talk about and we look at economics and look at papers usually done on China, it's usually talking about their state-owned and their closely affiliated private enterprises. And it doesn't really look so much at the wholly owned foreign entities, which is really, really an interesting case study that someone needs to look at. But the thing I was trying to point out is the fact that academics and economists have no problem segregating communism as their government political system from capitalism as their private economic system. And yet I have for a long time worried that this would eventually merge back together. And I think that we're beginning to see the beginning of that now. So specifically, you have Xi Jinping, who is now becoming more Maoist. He's looking back more to Mao and how Mao really ran things. And he's starting to make comments and he's starting to take actions that are against Western capitalism. He's starting to say that, we're not as enamored with Western capitalism as we once were. And, to his point, why should he be? He is a communist dictator. Supposedly elected. He is the leader of the CCP, the Communist Chinese Party. And as a communist leader, he wants as much control as he can have. And so this is why the internet is controlled in China. This is why you have a social credit score in China that impacts your ability to take certain jobs, to earn certain money, to make certain things. But the thing you have to understand about China, which is completely different than America, and so it's really hard for Americans to really understand and put their head around it. China does not operate their banking system the way that America does. The way America manages the reserve requirements of our banking system is through interbank loans, overnight interbank loans. You'll have heard of the repo market and the reverse repo market that the Federal Reserve uses overnight to get certain amount of funds to banks to meet their reserve requirements. So in other words, banks loan out the money. There's the money multiplier effect. They receive money in. They use the money multiplier effect to loan money out. They might not meet the reserve requirements that they need to meet because of all the loans they've made. So they use interbank loans and sometimes loans directly from the Federal Reserve to meet their reserve requirements. So America does not depend on American savings to meet reserve requirements. Now, this is a big problem for us when we have Great Depressions and we have runs on the bank, because the banking system isn't designed to support runs on the bank. It's just not. And this is why we had to shut down trading and we had to recall gold in 1935. And so at the Great Depression. So that is known. That is a known thing. But in China, the Chinese people are not allowed to spend all of their money. They have to save almost 2/3 of their money. And they have to save it either in a bank or they're allowed to buy property. And so what you're starting to see, this property problem, is because what have Chinese people invested in? They didn't want their money to sit in a bank with maybe a low return on a savings account, so they invested in property. So property is extremely overbought in China. 60 Minutes did a story on this, I want to say maybe 5 or 6 years ago now, about the 1 million person ghost cities in China that are everywhere, that the government supported. I mean, China supported artificially through government spending an 8% GDP for years. And how did they do this? They did this by building 1 million person ghost cities. And I'm not just saying that they just built, the condos. No, they built the high rises for the living units. They built malls. They built bridges. They built roads. They built infrastructure. They have multiple 1 million plus ghost cities that are not occupied with their people, but yet they've built it. And so they have artificially inflated their GDP for years. And so Xi Jinping now starting to talk negatively about Western capitalism is a wake-up call, because what we're starting to see now is that China is not necessarily able any longer to artificially continue to support what has been going on in China with and you have to realize they joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. So since 2001, they have grown to be the largest GDP producer, outsurpassing the United States. We're second largest. And if you look at the economic projections of how it's going to go, they are projected to continue growing in GDP as America is projected to continue to decline in GDP. And there's this time video that I could maybe somehow show you guys sometime, where you can see the economic projections of China and the United States is dropping. And of course, the United States, Americans don't want that. We don't want to lose our economic world superpower status. But unless we have some sort of divine intervention, it is inevitable that we will. And there are many reasons for that. Not the least of which is that we are really at a point now of potentially a no-go number of debt. In other words, we have 28 trillion. We've authorized 5 trillion last year in legislative practices, another 3 trillion between the Federal Reserve and the AFP plan that was passed in March. And now you have another 1 trillion and 3.5 trillion being discussed and negotiated in Congress. So, if you think of it, we again spent from October of 81. October of 81 is where America hit $1 trillion of debt for the very first time. So from October of 81 all the way through March of 2020, we had only accumulated nationally $28 trillion of debt. Since March of 2020, we have authorized and or spent already about $8 trillion in 1.5 years. And now we're talking about another 4.5 to 5 trillion. So if you look at that and you see that you're talking about almost $12 trillion of spending in less than 2 years, when it took us almost 40 years to get to 28 trillion. This is a completely unsustainable debt load. It's not possible. It's really reflective of the Keynesian economic theory of MMT, modern monetary theory, that basically says you can spend as much as you want indefinitely into perpetuity as long as you can service the debt. The problem is there is actually a point where you can no longer service the debt. And that point, we're very near it. I'd say at 30 trillion, and we probably really are at 30 trillion already, we just don't financially report it publicly. At 30 trillion, the servicing of the debt, even at extremely low interest rates, is so large it almost exceeds the cost that we spend on our military, Social Security, and Medicare combined. You start to get to a point where you actually can't service the debt. You start to see that MMT is really false. And it's not right. And this is why you've seen Jerome Powell and you've seen Christine Lagarde at the world level basically say inflation is transitory. They're saying it's transitory because by the time they realize it's not, their policies will have been implemented and it'll be too late to not have it be transitory. You know, we have oil traders that are right now trading oil, speculating that it's going to go to $200 a barrel. What do they know that we don't? What do they know that we don't? So going back to China and Xi Jinping, you know that the Evergrande disaster, actually I was in London when the Chinese equivalent of the Federal Reserve came out and said that they were not too big to fail, indicating that China was not willing to bail them out. And China property is heavily co-invested by BlackRock and some other super large worldwide asset managers, BlackRock being the world's largest asset manager with just about $8 trillion under management, a little less. So the reverberations of a Chinese property crisis is going to be a match that lights a torch in America. There is no doubt. The question is, what level of contagion is China to America? And it's interesting because in America, we call the 2008 financial crisis the Great Recession. And we think that it's applicable just to America, but it's not. In the rest of the world, they call it the GFC, the Great Financial Correction. And even though it was an American bank subprime lending, basically securitizes mortgage-backed securities as AAA grade bonds stamped by Moody's and Standard & Poor's sold on Wall Street, the world bought those bonds. This was a worldwide crisis. And so it affects everybody, and every economist in every part of the world studies the 2008 GFC, as we call it, the Great Recession. And so China is a contagion effect, and it is something that we need to be extremely aware of. The other thing that happened in China that I might have mentioned to you, but if not, I will mention it again, is that in June, beginning of July, they kicked out of their country all of the crypto miners, all of the blockchain miners they kicked out, because they are now moving to a digital blockchain for their Wuhan or the Chinese renminbi. So they are moving to digital currency. And what worries me is this merger that I see happening between their communism and their capitalism. And it was inevitable, in my opinion. And we're starting to see the beginning of that. Because once China has a digital currency where they have social credit scores and they can have the control to see everything that you earn and everything that you spend, they can disconnect you to the system like that, literally by just clicking a button on a keyboard. So this is where you're going to start to see the convergence of the communism and the capitalism in China that I've been worried about for a very, very long time. How that relates to America, besides being the contagion effect that I've already explained, is this reconciliation of this $3.5 trillion package that they're coming now down to say it will be less. I want to say something about that really fast before I forget, because I really am going to make my point now, and I'm going to forget this if I move on and give you the final point here before we wrap up. And that is this: we have to be ever careful of what we allow our government to get away with. So don't think that this administration is out of their mind when they come out and say, we want a $3.5 trillion infrastructure package plus another $1 trillion infrastructure package for more other things. So total $4.5 trillion, or, almost $5 trillion. They are strategically doing that so that when they negotiate down to some $2 trillion, we'll feel like we got a deal. But this is no deal. We have no business in the United States of America spending almost $5 trillion or $1 trillion or $2 trillion or $3 trillion or $4 trillion. Anything with a trillion, we have no business spending, because we haven't figured out yet how we're going to go to the American people and explain to them how we're going to pay for the debt we just incurred last year to get over the coronavirus. I'm used to the public world. I'm used to, publicly traded companies. When a board of directors wants to go out and do a capital raise for billions of dollars, there's a vote. You get to be involved. In America, the problem is we vote too infrequently. We vote these people in, then they stay in there, and they decide, okay, well, I don't get elected again for 2 more years. I can go ahead and do this. And Americans, we're so busy, and we're so busy with our work and our family and our TikTok and our social media that we don't pay attention, and we forget all about the fact that these people have been screwing us all along by enslaving us to debt to our children and our grandchildren. And we forget every time we go into the ballot box that they're doing this to us, because by the time we go to vote, it happened 2 years ago or 4 years ago. We need some kind of instantaneous national ability to vote on proposals and say, do you agree? Should we spend another several trillion when we haven't explained to you, the American people, how we're going to pay for the last $8 trillion that we used to deal with Corona? But back to the reconciliation and what this administration's trying to do. This administration, the Treasury Department of this administration, Janet Yellen, has promulgated a proposal, put forth a rule proposal that would require banks, every credit union, every bank in America, to report every transaction with specifics, who, when, and how much for every transaction that exceeds $600. And overall, every account, business and personal, would have to report to the IRS the total deposits and the total withdrawals. This is a nanny state. This is a communistic tactic. We in the United States of America have a voluntary tax system backed up by criminal penalties if you don't comply. We do not have in America prove to me that you're innocent by having third parties report your transactions to the US government. That is not a democracy. That is not a republic. That is not a free people. That is a people enslaved by their own government, because now they get to know how much we make. They get to know how much we're depositing. They get to know how much we're spending. Credit unions that are small, that have never taken a public stand, have sent social media messages and letters to all of their members to say, we don't get involved, but this is where the line gets drawn. We are not auditors. We are not state actors. We are not, going to be entrenched by the federal government. And that's probably the legal argument as I'm thinking through this as a lawyer, because this has happened before where the Supreme Court has decided if the federal government passes a rule, for example, no firearms, the case I'm trying to remember, Supreme Court case, I believe it was no firearms within so many miles of a school's, a school zone around a school. And they were wanting to enforce that through local police, and the state sued and the federal government and won, because the federal government has no authority to enjoin local actors to enforce their mandates or their laws, which is why we have to have like federal border security or ICE, because the state of Texas, the state of Arizona, the state of New Mexico, the state of California, they're not supposed to be enforcing federal immigration laws, which is why every time a president changes, the border changes so much, because how that president wants to enforce the existing laws changes dramatically depending on who's in. So this is the enjoyment of private institutions to spy on Americans. And this is not the first time this has happened. The NSA under the Patriot Act has national security letters, NSLs, that they send to your bank, to your cell phone company, and the bank and the cell phone company then have to send your bank records and your phone records, and they're not allowed to disclose to you that the federal government has requested your records. And so this has already started slightly under the Patriot Act, but now you have to just get an NSL letter to go and to happen. This would be just a blanket. Everyone is under an NSL letter, and every bank has to report automatically every year. It is not constitutional. It is a violation of our privacy, and it is a problem. And the reason that this administration is promulgating this out of the Treasury Department is because they know that they have to raise more revenue. And so they have already estimated that this level of surveillance will raise about $550 billion of revenue. So not even $1 trillion of revenue And we're in the middle of everything you do is tracked and monitored. And interestingly enough, a federal judge just ruled recently that what the NSA did with their mass surveillance program of Americans' phone records, that Edward Snowden, who's in Russia still to this day, political asylum in Russia, that Edward Snowden exposed, the mass dragnet that Edward Snowden exposed, was hailed by a federal judge in the last 2 weeks as right and a good thing to do, to let the people know that the government had been spying on them without their knowledge. Everyone thinks we have a Fourth Amendment, and we do, but we have had a lot of case law that has put a lot of holes in that Fourth Amendment. And after 9/11 and after the terrorist attacks, people allowed the fear of the terrorism to impugn their rights. And these are the things we got: the Patriot Act, these NSL letters, all came from terrorism. And now we have, similarly, Corona, that the health scare is making people allow them to give up some freedoms to the government. So think about that. Think about that. You know, it's always easy to give up freedom and to give over freedom to a higher power like a federal government when you think they're going to be able to protect you. But if you think that government will stop and actually back off and not surveil you when the threats die down, when the corona goes away, and when the threat of terrorism goes away, no, that's not how it works. You know, I always refer back to one truth about human nature, and that is power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So that's why we can't ever let any government official have absolute power over us in America. I say all this because all of this is related to economics, taxes, income. And so politics is a part of that world. And that's why we cover it all with taxes and crashes. I hope you enjoyed today's podcast, everybody. I went long today to give you some updated content since I've done it in a while. I hope that you enjoyed that. And we will be back on a regular schedule going forward on a weekly basis. Take care, everybody.